Just a fair word of warning before we start. I am going to try really hard to avoid talking about how I feel like this game has an addiction problem, specifically in regards to it designing itself in such a way that demands any and all new frames be capable of obliterating a small continent by just straining a little bit on the toilet. Now, don't get me wrong, I like big damage. A lot. But I don't know, do you remember when we got frames we considered good even if they couldn't nuke a tile? Trinity? Necros? Ivara? Dare I say, Loki? I don't know, I guess it feels like that we've fallen into a sorta single playstyle singularity in recent times. And as if to reinforce that, here arrives Dagath, a frame with a girl boner for marking enemies and spreading duplicated crit damage, just after we got a frame with a girl boner for marking enemies and spreading duplicated crit damage. But okay, I'll leave that discussion for a separate video. For now, we're gonna be looking at Dagath in a vacuum from now on. So, any hole's a goal, right? Dagath is a frame that confused me as I was learning to use her. I wasn't grasping what her power priority was meant to be, or how DE was intending for her to be used. So I went back and watched her reveal dev stream, and what I got was that her focus was primarily on applying and spreading marks which improve her damage output.
Tearing down their defenses, you're going to be spreading that curse, which is really important to the gameplay. And yeah, you're just going to be tearing through enemies with this cursed frame, really.
Which seems right, but there's a few decisions that left me scratching my head, which we'll get into in a bit. As always, starting with the passive, it is literally Arcane Energize, but for both energy and health, and also better. Picking up either orb type gives a 35% chance that the effectiveness of said orb will be increased by 300%. It has fantastic synergy with things like Energizing Grace, Amber Archon Shards, and best of all, it has no cooldown. This is the kind of passive that makes me wish we could change passives via Helminth for no particular reason or anything. And this is a good frame to have it on too, as Dagath tends to cast her powers about as many times as I stay indoors in a year. God, I'm such a neat! Now, I'm actually going to stray away from the usual power discussion order of first, second, third, and then fourth, and instead, I'm going to cover her second power first, since her first, third, and fourth powers all have conditionals relating to it. Doom causes Dagath to, presumably, screech out a space slur, causing all enemies within the radius to become marked with a special status effect, as indicated by the giant, not subtle at all, glowy sights above the target's head. The sight will hover over the target and observe a percentage of the damage that Dagath deals to said target. After a few seconds, the scythe will fly into the target, dealing damage equal to whatever the scythe observed. And if the scythe happens to observe enough damage to where its activation would be lethal, the scythe skips the rest of the countdown and immediately flies into the target. If a target survives the scythe, another will spawn once they take another instance of damage. So, put simply, this power duplicates her deeps. The more power strength you have, the more damage that the scythe can observe per hit. And thus, the easier it is to reach the death threshold and send them off to attack. Though it takes a hell of a lot of power strength to reach 100% duplication. Like, goddamn, what the fuck? However, the biggest advantage that Doom has, I feel, is that the scythes deal damage that ignore your target's armor. So, Doom is the pillar of her kit, with one power being able to spread it, and two others getting conditional buffs if Doom is on an enemy that it hits. So it's pretty evident that if your screen doesn't look like this, you're either doing something very wrong or something very right. However, I feel like I need to air some grievances with how this power functions. Warframe is a game in which you eventually get to the point where you become so powerful that you can accidentally insult a corpus and they'll fall over dead and immediately turn into ash. The point that I'm trying to make there is that most mobs die very easily, with a few exceptions like high-end steel circuit mobs and steel path heavy XMI. The issue is that these scythes often feel, I guess, redundant? Cause in order to get them to attack their target as soon as possible, you have to do a certain amount of damage to them. But chances are, if you can make that threshold within the 3 or so seconds that each scythe lasts, the poor fucker is likely already going to be dead from your attack too. And this is only further exacerbated by our third power, which we'll get into in a bit. So in these cases, your scythes become about as useful as tits on a doorknob. I get that you can technically say that about all buffs, like, you know, my weaponry here can still one-tap this guy with or without a Rhino buff or something, but at least with other buffs, you still see the impact through bigger number values. Here, if the target dies, the sights just vanish and do nothing. So I guess my problem is more how the power feels in those scenarios. Now, that's not to say that they aren't useful. They can be very efficient against heavy units, since it's harder to one-tap those guys, and AoE weaponry on Dagath in particular make the sights much more useful against trash mobs, given that AoE blasts often have damage fall off. But for most other situations, often the sights just don't get to do much. So, let me propose a fix. Originally, I wrote in the script that Doom targets should duplicate all damage that it takes to any other target with Doom as well, but then I realized that we'd just be making Colorvo 2, and me from the intro would be really pissed off. Not to mention, kind of busted? So instead, I feel like Doom should offer something besides damage just to make it more useful in more scenarios. Or at the very least, to improve the aesthetic feel of them, have sights register their damage numbers even if they impact a corpse. I'd make more suggestions, but every time I have an original thought, I lose a wrinkle in my brain. So let's move on. Next, getting into our first power, weird sights are another spinny blade AoE? I mean, I'm not complaining, I love orbitals. A short while after activation, weird sights will fly out and seek nearby enemies, with a seemingly infinite amount of punch through, while also inflicting viral. And, if the target is doomed, causes that target to spread doom to enemies nearby, and resets the doom timer. Are you seeing the subtle power synergy at play here? Oh, and it also slows them, as a treat, you know. Weird sights are essentially a more efficient spreader of Doom, to the point where you might as well always cast this power instead of Doom if your intent is to mark more enemies, since it's cheaper, has more potential coverage, and the damage that weird sights do is observed by the Doom sights that the weird sights spawn on hit. So you get an immediate jumpstart to building your way towards the Doom sight damage threshold. Whilst it's not the fastest way to kill, a very convenient and easy power rotation is to Doom a group and then spam weird sights. With high enough strength, your usual medium armored steel path mobs will fall relatively quickly, and you don't even have to engage more than 4 brain cells, since the weird sights home in on mobs, and Doom sights auto-magically deal the majority of the damage anyways. Again, not her most efficient damage dealing path, but it's very lazy, and I love laziness. Besides that though, there aren't many more intricacies to the power. I guess you can combine it with Aqua Blades and it looks pretty cool? Sure. Next is Grave Spirit, which probably earns the reward for most Warframe power of 2017. On cast, Dagath gains a crit damage buff for all of her weapons. Said buff's potency is doubled if the enemy that she's attacking is doomed. The buff lasts for a total of infinite seconds and also grants her an extra life should she die while the buff is active. During this state, she gains temporary invincibility, and for every doom kill she gets, those enemies drop health orbs. It also results in a 25-second cooldown before she can activate the power again. I would describe this power as boring, and that's exactly what it is. Grave Spirit is the power I mentioned earlier that kind of exacerbates Doomsight's problem of not being able to work because you obliterate a mob in one hit. Being able to multiply your crit damage by whatever percentage your power strength is at is really funny and really strong. So if you weren't already one-tapping mobs, then chances are you are now, unless you're using a status weapon with like a 5% crit chance, Lamau Stug Lamau. It's also such a simple power that I don't have much else to say about it. It's a permanent crit buff that you tap once per mission and then pretend that you don't have a third power slot. So, I guess moving on? And finally, Ricali's Cavalry. A power more confused about its own identity than I am about mine. It causes Dagath to send out a legion of horts to roll over any mob in their way. Okay, I have to admit a personal failing here. I have rewritten my thoughts on this power like 3 times because I can't tell if I like the fucking thing or not. For example, on one hand, it's nice to have an armor strip on our kit, but on the other, it's 100 energy base and is pretty linear. It does a hilarious amount of base damage, but many times it's overkill on mobs that aren't heavies, and for those guys, I can usually just take out my rifle and turn their face into a captcha puzzle. So now I'm set here on attempt number 4 of expressing my thoughts on these little shits, and I have arrived at the conclusion that I don't know. See, I personally don't feel the need to use Cavalry. Like, not even on trash mobs, because Doom and Weird Sights alone, with a good weapon, are more than capable of taking out groups without the absurd energy cost that these big boys demand. But at the same time, I can't deny that Cavalry is pretty damn good. In fact, building a one-button wonder Dagath who does nothing but launch murder horses at everyone is very viable. I don't know, I guess I just don't like how it feels, I guess? I'm not a fan of its costs, its coverage, how much it demands that you spend more energy to make it strip, things like that. Plus, if I'm using Cavalry too much, then I'm not spreading doom with weird sights, because weird sights can't spread doom using corpses. It also doesn't help that this power's range is dictated by your power duration, a stat that is otherwise almost useless on Dagath. Weird sights don't use it. Doom has plenty of base duration that even with transient fortitude and fleeting expertise, it can still last around 10 seconds, plus it gets extended by weird sights, and Grave Spirit literally lasts forever. So even though this power does a shit pants amount of damage, I don't think I can recommend using it all that much, especially when Grave Spirit is looking you dead in the eyes and is injecting every single crit weapon in your arsenal with space steroids. In a vacuum, this power is incredibly strong, but on Dagath, kinda redundant. If you were itching for another mob-marking frame, then Dagath is right up your alley. She has big damage, big spread, big crits, big horses, but for me personally, having sat through Kalervo's release, I was kinda ready for something else. Now, this isn't a slight to Dagath, it's more that I feel like she should have been released later, given how similar of a role she fills to the frame that released just before her. She's very strong in her current state, although I do think that the Doom status mechanic could use some tweaking to make it a little bit more impactful in certain scenarios, but besides that, she is damn solid. And I'm done with the video. I wonder if I can get this out before the concrete man drops. Never mind.